The African wilderness stretched endlessly under the golden hues of the setting sun. Vast savannas met towering trees, their thick canopies whispering with the wind's secrets. The land, both breathtaking and unforgiving, held stories of travelers, warriors, and lost souls. It was in this very wilderness that a young woman named Zala found herself, walking alone along an unfamiliar path. Her journey had begun with a caravan, a group of traders and travelers making their way across the land. But fate had played a cruel trick on her. A sudden attack by raiders had scattered the group, and in the chaos, Zala had been left behind. She had run for hours, hoping to find them again, but the land was vast, and the signs of their path had disappeared beneath the shifting winds. Now, with the sun dipping below the horizon, the shadows of night stretched across the wilderness like silent hunters. Zala's heart pounded. She needed shelter before darkness swallowed the land. Predators roamed the night. Lions, hyenas, and creatures even more terrifying whispered about in old folk tales. She quickened her pace, scanning her surroundings desperately. Just then, a distant rumble of thunder sent shivers down her spine. The storm was coming. As she pushed through thick undergrowth, she suddenly spotted a small hut nestled deep within the trees. Relief washed over her like a cool breeze. Someone lived there, someone who might offer her food, water, and safety. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and knocking gently on the wooden door. It creaked open, revealing a tall man with dark, piercing eyes. His face was partially hidden in the dim light, but his voice was warm. "You are lost, aren't you?" he asked. Zala nodded cautiously. The man stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the hut was simple yet welcoming. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and herbs. A small wooden table stood in the center, with a single chair beside it. The man walked over to the fire and motioned for Zala to sit. "You must be hungry," he said, offering her a bowl of food. Zala hesitated, but her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. With careful hands she accepted the bowl and took a bite. It was warm, delicious, a gift after a long, exhausting journey. For the first time in hours she felt safe. She exhaled deeply, her tense shoulders relaxing. Maybe, just maybe, her luck had changed. But then the sound of wood scraping against wood made her freeze. Her eyes darted toward the door just in time to see the man slide a thick wooden bolt into place. The click of the lock echoed through the room. Zala's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. The journey had begun with hope and excitement, but now it had become a struggle for survival. Zala, a young woman with a determined spirit, had set out with a caravan of traders traveling across the vast African wilderness. Her purpose was clear. She was accompanying her father, a well-known merchant, on a trade expedition. For years she had dreamed of seeing the great markets of distant villages, filled with colorful fabrics, rare spices, and shimmering beads. This journey was supposed to be her first step toward understanding the world beyond her homeland. But fate had other plans. One evening, as the caravan traveled through a dense and isolated stretch of savanna, disaster struck. A group of bandits emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden beneath cloth masks, their weapons gleaming under the moonlight. The attack was swift and brutal. People screamed, camels reared in fear, and chaos exploded around them. Zala had been separated from her father in the panic. She ran, her heart pounding, her feet carrying her away from the sounds of battle and into the unknown. Now, days later, she was alone, lost in an endless expanse of wilderness. Her once vibrant clothing was torn, her feet blistered from endless walking. She had managed to find small streams to drink from, but food was scarce. Hunger gnawed at her insides, making her weaker with every step. And the wild was merciless. At night, the land came alive with the eerie sounds of predators lurking in the shadows. She had seen the golden eyes of hyenas watching her from a distance, heard the distant roar of a lion echoing through the trees. Each night, she found herself clinging to whatever shelter she could, hiding beneath thick bushes, pressing her body close to fallen logs, praying she would survive until dawn. But her body was failing her. The exhaustion, the fear, the hunger, it was becoming unbearable. As the first drops of rain fell from the sky, she knew she had to find shelter soon. The storm clouds above promised a long, cold night, and she was already struggling to stay on her feet. Desperation gnawed at her soul. Then, through the thickening mist, she saw it, a small hut hidden within the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin wisp of gray rising into the sky. A sign of life. A sign of hope. Her heart leaped in her chest as she staggered toward it, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She reached the wooden door and raised a trembling fist, knocking twice. For a moment there was silence. Then the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his eyes shadowed beneath thick brows. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and dark skin weathered by time and hardship. There was a hint of concern in his gaze as he looked her up and down, taking in her disheveled appearance. "You are lost," he said, his voice deep but gentle. Zala nodded weakly. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "The storm is coming. You need rest." She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The hut was simple but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden light across the wooden walls. A pot of stew simmered over the flames, filling the air with the comforting aroma of cooked meat and herbs. A single table stood in the center, with a rough wooden chair beside it. The man, who introduced himself as Sefu, gestured for her to sit. "You must be hungry," he said, ladling some of the stew into a bowl. Zala's stomach twisted with hunger. She had not eaten a proper meal in days. She accepted the bowl gratefully, her hands shaking as she brought the spoon to her lips. The warmth of the food spread through her, a comfort she had almost forgotten. As she ate, Sefu sat across from her, watching quietly. His face was unreadable, but his words were kind. "It is dangerous for a young woman to travel alone," he said after a moment. "The wild is not forgiving." Zala nodded. She did not know whether to tell him the full truth yet. Could she trust him? She wanted to believe she was safe here, that this place was a refuge. But then, the door behind her groaned as Sefu slowly reached out and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. Click. Zala's grip tightened around the bowl. Something in the air shifted. The warmth of the hut suddenly felt suffocating. And deep inside her, a warning bell rang. She was trapped. The stew was warm, filling the hollow pit in Zala's stomach, but something in the air had changed. At first, she had welcomed the safety of this hut, a refuge from the storm, the wild animals, the cold. But now, as she sat near the crackling fire, spoon in hand, she began to notice small details that made her uneasy. Against the far wall, half hidden behind an old woven mat, a set of chains lay coiled on the floor. They were thick and rusted, the kind used to bind something, or someone. Her heart stuttered at the sight, a shiver creeping up her spine. She glanced toward the wooden walls, her eyes tracing the faint carvings etched into the surface. They were symbols she didn't recognize, spirals, jagged lines, and figures that looked eerily like twisted faces, mouths open in silent screams. A chill ran through her. What kind of place was this? She swallowed, trying to push the unease away. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation for all of this. Perhaps the chains were for securing animals, and the carvings were simply old tribal markings. But then she looked at Sefu. The man who had once seemed kind and welcoming was watching her too closely. His dark eyes never left her, his expression unreadable. At first, he had spoken with warmth, asking where she came from, how she had gotten lost. But now, his words had faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. He sat still, his hands resting on the wooden table, fingers drumming lightly against the surface. She could feel his gaze on her, following every move she made. Her instincts screamed at her. Something was wrong. She set her bowl down carefully. "I should go," she said, her voice even. Sefu tilted his head slightly. "Go?" he echoed. Zala forced a smile. "Yes. My caravan might still be searching for me. I should keep moving." For a moment he said nothing. Then, his lips curled into a slow smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "The night is dangerous," he said calmly. "You are safer here." The fire crackled, filling the silence that stretched between them. Zala's pulse pounded. Was that a warning? Or a threat? She stood up, forcing herself to appear casual. "Thank you for your kindness, but I must go." She turned toward the door, her fingers reaching for the handle. Then click. She froze. The sound was unmistakable, the heavy wooden bolt sliding into place, locking the door from the inside. Slowly she turned back around. Sefu was still sitting at the table, smiling. A slow, knowing smile. The air in the hut felt different now. He was in control. She was not. Her breath hitched. She was trapped. She glanced at the single window across the room. Could she break it? Could she run? Sefu noticed. His fingers stopped drumming on the table. "It is unwise to wander at night," he murmured. "The creatures of the forest are not as merciful as I am." Zala's hands clenched into fists. "Then unbolt the door." Sefu chuckled. "You are tired? Rest first. We will talk in the morning." Morning? No. She would not stay here. Her heart pounded as her eyes flicked back to the chains on the floor, to the strange carvings, to the locked door. She had walked into a trap. And now she had to find a way out. Zala's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panic would do her no good. She kept her face neutral, her breathing steady as she slowly lowered herself back onto the wooden stool by the fire. Her mind, however, was racing. She had to find a way out. Across the room, Sefu leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his cup. The flickering fire cast twisting shadows over his face, making his features appear sharper, more menacing. "You are lucky to have found me," he said in a low, deliberate voice. "The spirits of the forest are cruel to lost travelers." Zala met his gaze but said nothing. Sefu exhaled almost wistfully. "Many have wandered through these woods thinking they could find their way back. But the spirits do not forgive trespassers." Zala swallowed. Was he warning her? Or was this just another trick? He tilted his head. "Tell me, Zala, do you believe in fate?" She stiffened at the sound of her name. She had never told him. How did he know? Her fingers gripped the edge of her tunic beneath the table, willing herself to appear unfazed. "Perhaps," she said carefully. Sefu nodded. "Fate brought you here. It always does." The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. "Always." She glanced toward the wooden walls, pretending to admire the carvings. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim firelight, she noticed something else, something far more disturbing. Scratches. Deep, jagged gouges etched into the wood, barely visible beneath the strange symbols. Long, frantic marks, the kind made by desperate hands. Her stomach twisted. She glanced toward the farthest corner of the room. The chains lay there, coiled like a sleeping serpent. Now she could see the stains on the floor near them, dark, old, and unmistakable. Her breath came faster, but she bit her tongue, forcing herself to stay composed. Sefu was watching her again. He was enjoying this. "No one ever leaves my hut, Zala." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but the words hit her like a hammer. She forced herself to look at him, her expression unreadable. "And why is that?" Sefu smiled, his teeth gleaming in the firelight. "Because the spirits do not allow it." Zala held his gaze, but her mind was spinning. "What? All of it? This wasn't about spirits. This was about him." She knew now she wasn't the first traveler to find this hut. And if she didn't act fast, she wouldn't be the last. Fear gripped her, cold and unrelenting. But beneath it, something stronger stirred. She would not die here. She had to outsmart him. Zala's mind raced as she sat stiffly on the wooden stool, her pulse thundering in her ears. She had to escape, but how? Sefu had locked the door. The window was shut tightly. The walls were thick, but they were still made of wood. And that's when she remembered something her grandmother once told her. Fire can break even the strongest barriers if you know how to use it. Zala swallowed, keeping her face neutral. She needed to start a fire, small enough to stay unnoticed at first but big enough to cause chaos. But she had to be careful. If he suspected anything, she'd never get another chance. She turned toward Sefu and forced a smile. "Tell me more about the spirits," she said, keeping her voice steady. "How do you know they exist?" Sefu's expression shifted, pleased by her interest. "Good. He likes to talk." As he launched into a tale about a wandering soul that was never seen again, Zala's hands worked silently beneath the table. The edge of her sleeve concealed a small blade sewn into the fabric, a precaution her grandmother had insisted on before she left home. She carefully ran the blade against the wooden frame of the window, loosening it, working slowly so as not to make a sound. But she needed more time. She glanced at the fire in the hearth. The embers were glowing, but it wasn't strong enough to spread. She needed an excuse to add more wood. "It's getting cold," she said softly. "May I add another log?" Sefu studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Go ahead." Zala moved to the fire, casually choosing the driest piece of wood she could find. She placed it inside, shifting the embers slightly, just enough for a few sparks to land on the edge of the woven mat nearby. It was a risk. But she had no choice. Sefu continued speaking, unaware of what was happening behind him. Zala returned to her seat, watching as the fire caught the edge of the mat. The flames flickered, then spread, slowly at first. She needed to move fast. She pressed the blade deeper into the window frame, working quickly, loosening the wood little by little. Then, a crackling sound. The flames had reached the wooden wall. Sefu stiffened, his nostrils flaring. He smelled it. He turned, eyes narrowing as he spotted the growing flames. "What have you done?" Zala acted instantly. She yanked at the loosened window frame with all her strength. It gave way just enough. The flames leaped higher, licking the walls. Sefu rushed to stomp out the fire, distracted just as she had hoped. She squeezed through the gap, scraping her arms against the rough wood. Behind her, Sefu roared. She hit the ground outside, breathless. She didn't stop to look back. Zala ran into the night, free but not safe yet. Zala's feet pounded against the damp earth as she sprinted through the dense forest, her breath ragged. Branches tore at her skin, but she didn't stop, she couldn't stop. Behind her, Sefu's furious shouts echoed through the trees. "You can't escape me." Fear pushed her forward. She had been lucky to slip away, but she was still in danger. Sefu knew this forest better than she did. If she wasn't careful, he would catch her. She needed to be smart. Outmaneuvering the hunter. Zala forced herself to slow down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She remembered her father's lessons about tracking. A hunter follows the easiest path. Confuse his trail and he'll waste time searching. Her heart still racing, she veered to the left, stepping onto a narrow stream, letting the water hide her footprints. She moved carefully, stepping on stones and exposed roots to avoid leaving a trail in the mud. Behind her, Sefu's footsteps grew louder. Zala pressed her back against a large tree, holding her breath. Sefu's shadow passed close by. He paused, scanning the trees. For a terrifying moment, she thought he would hear her pounding heart. But then he moved on. Zala waited until his footsteps faded, then took off in another direction. She knew there was a village nearby. If she could just reach it before he caught her, she would be safe. Dawn's first light and a desperate warning. After what felt like hours, the first light of dawn broke through the trees. In the distance, she saw smoke rising from huts. The village. Relief flooded her, but she didn't stop running. She had to warn them. As she stumbled into the village, the elders and warriors gathered, startled by her sudden arrival. "Please listen," she gasped, her voice desperate. "There's a man in the forest, a dangerous man. He traps travelers in his hut and never lets them go." The village chief, an elderly man with wise, piercing eyes, nodded gravely. "We have heard whispers of such a man before," he said. "But no one has ever escaped to tell us the truth." Zala told them everything, how he locked her in, the strange carvings, the scratches on the walls. The warriors exchanged looks of fury. "He has taken others," one of them said. "We must stop him." Setting the trap. As the warriors prepared their weapons, Zala had an idea. "He'll be looking for another victim soon," she said. "What if we make him think he's found one?" The villagers agreed. A young woman from the village volunteered to act as bait, pretending to be a lost traveler. Meanwhile, the warriors hid in the trees, waiting. Sefu's capture. It didn't take long. As expected, Sefu emerged from the forest, his face twisted with anger and frustration. When he saw the young woman wandering alone near the village's edge, his expression changed. He smiled just like he had smiled at Zala. "You look lost," he said smoothly. "Come with me. I have food and shelter." The woman pretended to hesitate just enough to make it seem real. Then, the warriors sprang into action. Sefu barely had time to react before he was surrounded. Spears pointed at his chest. His eyes widened in shock. "Wait. You don't understand." But there was nothing left to say. The village chief stepped forward. "We understand perfectly. And you will never take another soul again." As the sun rose, Zala finally felt safe. She had survived. And now, Sefu would never hurt anyone again. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the village gathered around Sefu, who sat on the ground, his hands bound, his face twisted in anger and fear. The elders questioned him, demanding the truth. But Sefu at first refused to speak. Then an old man stepped forward, his voice heavy with sorrow. "We have heard whispers of travelers who never returned from these forests," he said. "Now we know why." One by one, villagers spoke of missing daughters, lost traders, and lone wanderers who had disappeared. Zala, standing with her arms crossed, looked Sefu in the eye. "How many have you trapped?" she demanded. Sefu's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing. Then an elder woman lifted a small bag that had been found among his belongings. She emptied its contents onto the ground. A hush fell over the crowd. Beads, rings, trinkets, all from those who had never returned. The truth was undeniable. His punishment, banishment. The village elders stepped aside to decide Sefu's fate. Some called for revenge. Others believed death was too easy. Finally, the eldest among them, a wise woman named Mama Kalima, raised her hand. The crowd fell silent. To kill him would be a quick punishment, she said. But true justice is suffering the fate he gave to others. She turned to Sefu, her expression unreadable. You will be banished. You will wander the land alone, never knowing shelter, never knowing safety. Just as you made others fear for their lives, so too will you live in fear. The villagers dragged Sefu to the edge of the forest. They cut the ropes from his hands, but not before marking his forehead with red clay, a sign of exile. If you are seen near another village, the elders warned, you will not live to see the next sunrise. With no choice, Sefu stumbled into the wilderness, disappearing among the trees. He was never seen again. Zala's strength and survival. Though justice had been served, Zala still felt the weight of what had happened. The memories of the locked door, the eerie carvings, and Sefu's sinister gaze lingered in her mind. But she was not the same frightened girl who had stumbled upon that hut. She had fought. She had outsmarted her captor. She had survived. As she sat by the village fire that night, an elder placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You are stronger than you know, child. Zala smiled softly, staring into the flames. She had learned a harsh truth. Not all dangers come with snarling teeth and sharpened claws. Sometimes they wear the mask of kindness. And that lesson she would never forget. The legend lives on. Years passed and Zala's story spread across the land. Travelers whispered of the girl who escaped the stranger's hut. Villagers warned their children, never trust a kind smile too soon. Always listen to your instincts. And deep in the forest where an abandoned hut once stood, only ashes remained. The wind carried the tale of Zala, the girl who refused to be a victim, the girl who turned fear into wisdom. A legend that would never fade. The village square was silent as the elders gathered, their expressions grim. The truth was now undeniable. Sefu, the man who had lured Zala into his hut, was not just a lone predator. He had done this before. The dark past revealed. As the elders questioned him, Sefu refused to speak, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. But the evidence was clear. A young hunter stepped forward, holding a bundle of ornate beads, trinkets, and small personal items, things that belonged to travelers who had gone missing over the years. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people recognized some of the items. A mother clutched a carved bracelet, whispering her lost son's name. A trader's apprentice found the pendant of his long-vanished master. The elders turned to Sefu. How many? One of them demanded. Sefu said nothing. But his silence was answer enough. The weight of justice. The village council gathered to decide his fate. Some called for revenge, others for imprisonment. But one elder, a wise woman named Mama Kalima, raised her hand. His punishment should fit his crime. The crowd quieted, listening intently. He preyed on the lost and the weak. He lured them in with kindness, then trapped them. Now let him know the life of a hunted man. Let him wander, never finding rest, just as he did to others. The elders murmured in agreement. Sefu would be banished. Banishment, a fate worse than death. At dawn, the warriors escorted Sefu to the edge of the forest. His wrists were freed, but before letting him go, the village shamans marked his forehead with red clay, the sign of exile. This mark tells all who see you that you are cursed, an elder warned. No village will take you in. No traveler will trust you. Wherever you go, you will be alone. Sefu's face twisted in fear. He opened his mouth to beg, but the warriors turned their backs. With one final shove, he was sent into the wilderness. The last anyone saw of him, he was disappearing into the trees, forever doomed to live as he made others live, afraid, alone, and hunted. Zala's strength and realization. Though justice had been served, Zala felt the weight of what she had endured. The locked door. The eerie carvings. The eyes that watched her every move. She had fought for her life. She had survived. As she sat by the fire that night, an elder placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You are stronger than you know, child. Zala nodded, but she knew she had changed. She had learned a harsh truth. Not all monsters have fangs or claws. Sometimes they wear the mask of kindness. And that lesson she would never forget. A warning that became a legend. As the years passed, Zala's story spread far beyond the village. Travelers shared her tale, warning others to never ignore their instincts. Mothers told their children, beware the stranger who is too kind. Trust your heart and never ignore the signs of danger. And deep in the forest where Sefu's hut once stood, nothing remained but ashes. The wind carried the whispers of Zala's name, a survivor, a warrior, a warning. A legend that would never fade. At first, Sefu appeared to be a kind-hearted stranger, offering warmth and shelter to Zala in her time of need. But behind his gentle voice and welcoming gestures lurked a dark and sinister intent. This story teaches us that not all who extend a helping hand do so out of kindness. Some use generosity as a trap, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It is easy to assume the best in others, especially when we are desperate or vulnerable. However, true wisdom lies in understanding that appearances can be deceiving. Zala learned this firsthand when the very man who saved her from the storm became the greatest threat to her life. Trust your instincts. Danger often disguises itself as safety. From the moment Zala stepped into the hut, her instincts warned her that something was off. The chains, the eerie carvings, and Sefu's unsettling gaze, all were signs that something was not right. Had she ignored these feelings, she might not have survived. This story reminds us to always trust our gut instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Fear is not always a weakness. Sometimes, it is a guide that leads us away from danger and towards safety. Courage, intelligence, and quick thinking can turn the tide in any situation. Zala was trapped, alone, and seemingly powerless. But instead of giving in to fear, she used her intelligence to plan her escape. She distracted Sefu, created a fire, and found a way out, all while keeping her emotions in check. Her quick thinking and resourcefulness turned what seemed like a hopeless situation into one where she had the upper hand. This shows that even in the darkest moments, the right mindset can create a path to survival. The lesson here is clear. Bravery is not about being fearless, but about acting wisely despite the fear. The consequences of evil deeds always catch up with those who commit them. Sefu had harmed many travelers before Zala, believing he could continue his wicked ways without consequence. But in the end, justice caught up with him. His own actions led to his downfall. By trapping others, he sealed his own fate. Instead of being a hunter, he became the hunted, forced to wander the wilderness alone, without shelter or mercy. This reflects an important truth. Evil may seem to go unpunished for a time, but it always comes back in the end. Whether through the hands of fate, the actions of the brave, or the judgment of a community, those who harm others will eventually face the consequences of their deeds. Final thought. Zala's story is more than just a tale of survival. It is a warning, a lesson, and an inspiration. It reminds us to stay alert, trust ourselves, and never underestimate our own strength. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with weapons, but with wisdom, courage, and the will to survive.